At my sister's wedding, my parents demanded I hand over my penthouse keys right in front of over 300 guests. I said no. My mother slapped me so hard, my diamond earring flew across the marble floor. I did not cry. I simply picked up my earring, walked out of the ballroom, and made a phone call. An hour later, a man showed up at the reception, and when my mother saw who he was, she started screaming. If you have ever been the family scapegoat only to hold their entire future in your hands, keep listening. The crystal chandeliers at the Drake Hotel in Chicago cast a warm glow over the extravagant rehearsal dinner, but the atmosphere in the private VIP lounge was freezing cold. I stood surrounded by my family and the wealthy Chamberlain family. My sister Alana clutched the arm of her white fiancé, Preston Chamberlain, who came from a long line of old money elites. My mother Vivian adjusted her pearl necklace and glared at me. Her smile was tight for the audience, but her eyes were full of venom. She pulled a thick legal document from her clutch and slapped it onto the mahogany table. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line. "Sign it, Maya," she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are giving your sister and Preston the Gold Coast penthouse as a wedding gift. It is the only acceptable contribution you can make to this union." I looked down at the transfer papers. The $5 million penthouse she was referring to was the one I currently lived in. My mother had no idea that I actually owned the entire building through a corporate trust. She thought I was just renting it on a basic data analyst salary. In her mind, I was the socially awkward disappointment of the Jenkins family. "You want me to sign over the place where I live?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Alana rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Maya," she groaned. "You barely even use the space. You sit in the dark typing on your computer all weekend. Preston and I need a prominent residence in the city to entertain his family's business associates. You can easily find a small studio apartment somewhere else. It makes far more sense for us to have it." Preston let out a condescending snicker, taking in my simple black dress. "Look, Maya," he said, using that slow, patronizing tone people use when talking to children. "We know you do not exactly run in our circles. The Chamberlain family legacy requires a certain standard of living. Your parents have been very generous in offering to cover the transfer taxes. You should be proud to help your sister marry into our world." My mother nodded enthusiastically, shoving a gold pen directly into my hand. "Do not embarrass us," Vivian hissed, grabbing my wrist. "We told them you were moving out of state for a low-level job and wanted to gift the penthouse to the newlyweds, to show gratitude for everything this family has done for you. You owe us this, Maya. Sign the paper right now, or I will have security escort you out." I slowly pulled my wrist out of my mother's tight grip. I looked at Alana browsing luxury furniture catalogs on her phone. I looked at Preston whispering a cruel joke to his father about my modest appearance. And finally, I looked at Vivian, the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was taking up too much space. I picked up the heavy legal document. They really thought I was just a naive target for their desperate social climbing ambitions. I placed the gold pen gently back onto the polished mahogany table. Then I gripped the top of the thick document and ripped it straight down the middle. I stacked the two torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto the expensive hotel carpet. "I will not be signing anything," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "And I will not be paying for your pathetic social climbing experiments. If Preston is as wealthy as he claims to be, he can certainly buy his own penthouse." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston's father stopped talking mid-sentence. Alana dropped her phone onto the table. Vivian's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The facade of the elite Jenkins family shattered in a single instant. Her chest heaved as she stepped toward me, all pretense of elegance gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered rage. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. Before I could even blink, Vivian raised her hand and struck me across the face with everything she had. The slap was so violent it echoed through the luxurious room like a gunshot. The sheer force snapped my head to the side, and my heavy diamond earring snagged on her wedding ring, tearing loose and flying across the room. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, distinct ping. Guests gasped loudly. Members of the Chamberlain family stepped back in shock, muttering about the scandalous display of violence. My cheek burned with a fiery, intense heat, but I did not bring my hand up to touch it. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear or utter a single word of pain. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. Her chest was heaving, and for a split second a flash of panic crossed her eyes when she realized I was not breaking down crying like she expected. I calmly turned around and walked over to where my earring had fallen. I picked up the diamond stud and secured it in my hand. The entire room watched me in stunned, breathless silence, expecting a massive breakdown. Instead, I stood up straight, smoothed my dress, and pulled my phone from my clutch. I dialed a specific number I had kept on speed dial for 3 long years, waiting patiently for the exact moment my family would cross the point of no return. Elias. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion striking through the silence of the room. It is me. Execute Grandmother Josephine's Directive 4. I did not wait for a response. I slipped the phone back into my bag, turned my back on my mother's horrified face, and walked confidently out of the ballroom. The real wedding gift was about to be delivered, and they had absolutely no idea the level of destruction coming for them. At my sister's wedding, my parents demanded I hand over my penthouse keys, right in front of over 300 guests. I said no. My mother slapped me so hard, my diamond earring flew across the marble floor. I did not cry. I simply picked up my earring, walked out of the ballroom, and made a phone call. An hour later, a man showed up at the reception, and when my mother saw who he was, she started screaming. If you have ever been the family scapegoat only to hold their entire future in your hands, keep listening. The crystal chandeliers at the Drake Hotel in Chicago cast a warm glow over the extravagant rehearsal dinner, but the atmosphere in the private VIP lounge was freezing cold. I stood surrounded by my family and the wealthy Chamberlain family. My sister Alana clutched the arm of her white fiancé Preston Chamberlain, who came from a long line of old money elites. My mother Vivian adjusted her pearl necklace and glared at me. Her smile was tight for the audience, but her eyes were full of venom. She pulled a thick legal document from her clutch and slapped it onto the mahogany table. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line. "Sign it, Maya," she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are giving your sister and Preston the Gold Coast penthouse as a wedding gift. It is the only acceptable contribution you can make to this union." I looked down at the transfer papers. The $5 million penthouse she was referring to was the one I currently lived in. My mother had no idea that I actually owned the entire building through a corporate trust. She thought I was just a basic data analyst renting a space I could barely afford. In her mind, I was the socially awkward disappointment of the Jenkins family. "You want me to sign over the place where I live?" I asked, keeping my voice completely level. Alana rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Maya," she groaned, shifting her weight in her custom designer gown. "You barely even use the space. You sit in the dark typing on your computer all weekend, hiding from the world. Preston and I need a prominent residence in the city to entertain his family business associates. You can easily find a small studio apartment somewhere else. It makes far more sense for us to have it." Preston let out a condescending snicker, taking in my simple black dress and natural hair. "Look, Maya," he said, using that slow, patronizing tone people use when talking to someone they believe is entirely beneath them. "We know you do not exactly run in our circles. The Chamberlain family legacy requires a certain standard of living and a specific zip code to maintain our social standing in Chicago. Your parents have been very generous in offering to cover the transfer taxes for the deed. You should be proud to help your sister marry into our world." My father Harrison stood quietly in the background, swirling his bourbon. He did not say a word to defend me, but his silence was a deafening endorsement of their cruelty. My mother nodded enthusiastically, shoving a gold pen directly into my hand. "Do not embarrass us," Vivian hissed, grabbing my wrist with fingers that dug into my skin. "We told the Chamberlains you were moving out of state for a low-level job and wanted to gift the penthouse to the newlyweds to show gratitude for everything this family has done for you. You owe us this, Maya. Sign the paper right now, or I will have hotel security escort you out through the service elevator." I slowly pulled my wrist out of my mother-tight grip. I looked at Alana, who was casually browsing luxury furniture catalogs on her phone, already planning how she would redecorate my living room. I looked at Preston, who was whispering a cruel joke to his father about my modest appearance. And finally, I looked at Vivian, the woman who had spent my entire 31 years of life, making me feel like I was taking up too much space in her perfect world. I picked up the heavy legal document. They really thought I was just a naive, powerless target for their desperate social climbing ambitions. I placed the gold pen gently back onto the polished mahogany table. Then I gripped the top of the thick document and ripped it straight down the middle. I stacked the two torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto the expensive hotel carpet like grotesque confetti. "I will not be signing anything," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "And I will not be paying for your pathetic social climbing experiments, Vivian. If Preston is as wealthy as he claims to be, he can certainly afford to buy his own penthouse." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Preston's father stopped talking mid-sentence, his face turning pale. Alana dropped her phone onto the table with a loud clatter. Vivian's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The flawless facade of the elite Jenkins family shattered in a single instant right in front of the people they were trying so desperately to impress. Her chest heaved as she stepped toward me, all pretense of elegance gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered rage. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. Before I could even blink or step back, Vivian raised her hand and struck me across the face with everything she had. The slap was so violent it echoed through the luxurious VIP lounge like a gunshot. The sheer force snapped my head to the side, and my heavy diamond earring snagged on her diamond wedding ring, tearing loose and flying across the room. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, distinct ping that seemed to freeze time itself. Guests gasped loudly. Members of the Chamberlain family stepped back in shock, muttering about the scandalous display of violence. My cheek burned with a fiery, intense heat, but I did not bring my hand up to touch it. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear or utter a single word of pain. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. Her chest was heaving, and for a split second a flash of pure panic crossed her eyes when she realized I was not breaking down crying like she expected. I calmly turned around and walked over to where my earring had fallen near the velvet curtains. I bent down, picked up the diamond stud, and secured it tightly in my hand. The entire room watched me in stunned, breathless silence, expecting a massive emotional breakdown or a screaming match. Instead, I stood up straight, smoothed the wrinkles from my simple black dress, and pulled my phone from my clutch. I dialed a specific number I had kept on speed dial for 3 long years, waiting patiently for the exact moment my family would cross the point of no return. "Elias," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, striking through the heavy silence of the room. "It is me. Execute Grandmother Josephine Directive 4. I did not wait for a response. I slipped the phone back into my bag, turned my back on my mother's horrified face, and walked confidently out of the ballroom. The real wedding gift was about to be delivered, and they had absolutely no idea the level of destruction coming for them. The glass doors of the hotel closed behind me, shutting out the music and the arrogant whispers of the crowd. The night air hit my cheek, offering a rush of clarity. I walked down the marble steps with measured strides, leaving the chaos behind me. Marcus was waiting by the curb next to my black Maybach. He opened the door without a single question. I slid into the plush leather seat and let the quiet luxury wrap around me. Marcus pulled away, merging into the downtown traffic. My phone began to vibrate against the smooth seat. It vibrated continuously in a relentless rhythm. I picked it up and stared at the screen. The name Harrison flashed across the display, followed by a massive flood of incoming text messages. My father was absolutely furious. The preview lines showed his complete outrage. I unlocked the screen and opened the thread, reading his vicious words with terrifying calmness. He typed in all capital letters, demanding to know how I could be so selfish and ungrateful. "You ruined your sister's special night," he wrote. "You humiliated us in front of the Chamberlain family." He called me a worthless embarrassment and said I owed them the penthouse. He typed that I owed them my existence because they gave me life and kept a roof over my head. The hypocrisy of his words was almost amusing. He sent another long paragraph, reminding me of the sacrifices he claimed they made for my upbringing. We paid for your existence. You owe us this apartment after everything we endured to raise a difficult child like you. I stared at the message, remembering the actual truth. I remembered being 19 years old and discovering that my entire college fund was gone. Every penny my grandmother Josephine set aside for my education had vanished. Harrison and Vivian had drained it completely to save his failing logistics company from bankruptcy. They stole my future to pay off bad business debts they accumulated through their own incompetence. When I confronted them, they told me I was being selfish and that family comes first. They forced me to take out massive student loans to survive while Alana got a car. They spent years convincing everyone, including the wealthy Chamberlains, that I was just a low-level data analyst, struggling to get by. They painted a picture of a daughter who rented a small space she could not afford. They needed me to be a failure so they could feel better about their own empty lives. I did not type a single word in response to his threats. I simply locked the screen and took a deep breath. The pain on my cheek from Vivian slapping me was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. Time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. I opened my contact list and pressed the name Lauren. The call connected on the second ring. Lauren was my chief operating officer and the only person outside of my legal team who knew the full scope of my daily operations. She answered with her usual crisp efficiency. Maya, she said, her voice sounding clear through the car speakers. Is everything all right tonight? I leaned back against the headrest, watching the bright city lights blur past the windows. The windows, everything is perfectly fine, Lauren, I replied, keeping my tone flat. I need you to initiate the final phase for the Chamberlain portfolio right now. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on her end of the line. The Chamberlain debt package, she asked, verifying the target. I confirmed it without hesitation. Yes, the entire $40 million portfolio. For the past 3 years, my family thought I was sitting in a cubicle crunching numbers for a salary. They had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital. I built a ruthless financial technology firm that specialized in acquiring and liquidating distressed commercial debt. We bought bad loans from failing empires and stripped them down for parts. And the Chamberlain family, the old money elites who had just laughed at my simple black dress, were completely bankrupt. Their hotel chain was drowning in toxic debt, and my firm had quietly purchased every single one of their loans just 3 days ago. Lauren paused her typing. We are fully vested, Maya, she reported. We own the paper on all their properties and the personal guarantees signed by Preston and his father. What is the immediate directive? I watched a raindrop slide down the window. Prepare the foreclosure notices for all Chamberlain assets. I instructed. I want the liquidation orders finalized and ready for my signature by tomorrow morning. They think they are marrying into vast wealth, but they are marrying into a financial graveyard. Understood. Lauren said, her tone shifting to business. And what about the Jenkins Logistics Company? Do we proceed with the internal audit? I smiled in the darkness of the car. My father thought he had saved his failing logistics business with my stolen college fund. But he only delayed the inevitable collapse. I had spent the last 2 years anonymously buying up his vendor debts. Leave the logistics company alone. For now, I told Lauren, I have a different plan for Harrison and Vivian. Just ensure the Chamberlain portfolio is locked and loaded. I will review the documents tonight. I ended the call just as the Maybach turned onto a quiet residential street. My phone vibrated again, but this time it was not an angry text from my father. It was an incoming call from Elias Thorne. He was the most feared corporate lawyer in Chicago and the sole executor of my late grandmother Josephine estate. I was also the only man who knew the full extent of my immense wealth. I answered the call immediately. Maya, Elias said, his deep voice resonating with a dangerous kind of amusement. I received your message and verified the security protocols. Directive 4 is officially active. I pulled up the trust documents and the property deeds. Everything is completely airtight and ready for deployment. He paused, letting the heavy weight of the moment settle between us in the silent car. I have my private security team standing by downstairs, and the red folders are securely locked in my briefcase. The documents. Are ready, Maya? Should we crash a wedding? Elias, I said, my voice steady and cold. Tell the driver to turn the vehicle around. We are heading back to the Drake Hotel right now. I heard Elias chuckle through the speaker. He was sitting in his downtown office waiting for this exact moment. For 3 long years, we had meticulously planned every single detail of this night. Tell me you are wearing the diamond earrings, he said, his tone shifting to complete business mode. I am holding one of them in my hand right now, I replied. Vivian slapped the other one clean off my face. She decided to perform for the Chamberlain family. She actually thought she could force me to sign over my own penthouse just to impress a bunch of bankrupt racists. Elias let out a heavy sigh over the phone. Josephine always knew they would cross the ultimate line. Maya, your grandmother was a brilliant woman. She warned me. Vivian would eventually resort to violence if she felt her social standing was threatened. Hearing my grandmother being mentioned sent a wave of powerful memories rushing through my mind. Josephine Jenkins was a true legend in Chicago. She built a massive real estate and logistics empire entirely from scratch as a Black woman, navigating the brutal corporate world of the 1970s. She was ruthless, brilliant, and completely immune to the fake glamour of the Gold Coast elite. She saw right through my parents. Harrison and Vivian spent their entire lives desperately trying to climb the social ladder. They cared more about country club memberships and designer labels than they cared about actual hard work or their own daughter. When grandmother Josephine was diagnosed with terminal cancer, she called me and Elias into her private hospital room. She knew exactly what would happen if she left her wealth to my father. He would blow it all on bad investments and luxury cars to impress people who secretly despised him. So we created the ultimate illusion, I told Elias. Looking out the dark window at the passing city lights, she publicly cut me out of the will. She made a huge spectacle of leaving me absolutely nothing, so that Harrison and Vivian would stop paying attention to me. They thought I was a useless failure, and they ignored me completely. Elias picked up the narrative smoothly, and while they were busy laughing at your supposed misfortune, Josephine secretly transferred the master trust into your name, making you the sole controller of the entire Jenkins family fortune. Every single asset they think they own is actually legally yours. It was the perfect trap. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window. For 3 years, I let them live in that massive mansion. I paid the mortgage through the blind trust. I paid for my mother expensive cars and my father ridiculous country club fees. I even paid the vendors for this lavish $200,000 wedding tonight. I gave them every single opportunity to show just 1 ounce of genuine love or humility. I explained, my grip tightening on the diamond earring. In my hand, I stayed in the background, working on my own fintech firm, letting them enjoy the money. I funded their entire fake rich lifestyle just to see how far their greed would stretch, and tonight they proved they have no bottom. The slap was the final straw. I continued, my heart beating with a calm, steady rhythm. They tried to steal the roof over my head to impress a family of white elites who looked down on us. I am done playing the silent benefactor. Elias cut them off completely, shut down every credit card freeze, every bank account attached to the master trust. It is already done. Maya, Elias confirmed, his voice echoing with absolute authority. I initiated the total asset freeze. The second you gave the directive. Their black cards will decline by midnight. The mansion is scheduled for immediate seizure, and the cars will be repossessed tomorrow morning. Good, I said. The Maybach took a sharp turn, heading back toward the magnificent mile where the Drake Hotel stood illuminated against the night sky. I am pulling up to the main entrance now, Elias said. I hear the music from the ballroom. They are about to cut the wedding cake. They have no idea. The financial executioner is standing right outside. I told Marcus to pull the car up to the front doors. My driver expertly navigated through the chaotic downtown traffic, bringing the heavy luxury vehicle to a smooth stop right behind a line of valet-parked cars. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp Chicago air. The wind whipped around me, but I felt completely grounded, entirely untouchable. I looked up the grand steps of the hotel and saw Elias Thorne standing under the golden awning. He looked incredibly intimidating in his tailored charcoal suit, holding a thick black leather briefcase that contained the financial ruin of both the Jenkins and the Chamberlain families. Flanking him were four massive men dressed in tactical black suits. These were not standard hotel guards. They were elite private security contractors I had hired, specifically for this exact moment. Elias walked down the marble steps to meet me, handing me a sleek black folder adorned with the gold crest of the Josephine Master. Trust, the paperwork is perfect. Maya, he said, looking at the red mark still blooming across my right cheek. Your mother is going to regret that strike for the rest of her miserable life. I took the folder, feeling the heavy weight of justice in my hands. The music from the grand ballroom echoed out into the street, mixing with the sounds of traffic and city life. Alana and Preston were inside smiling for the cameras, pretending to be the ultimate power couple, while Vivian and Harrison toasted to their own fake success. They wanted me to be a socially unfit outcast hiding in the shadows, I said, looking at the massive wooden doors of the hotel lobby. They wanted me to disappear so they could steal my penthouse and continue living their pathetic lies. I adjusted my dress and signaled for the security team to form up behind me. Elias stepped to my right, adjusting his briefcase with a cold, calculated smile. It is time to go. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom stood before us like the gates of a fake kingdom. I could hear the muffled sounds of a 10-piece jazz band playing a lively tune. Inside, the air in the hallway smelled of expensive catering and imported flowers. Four private security contractors took their positions flanking me and Elias perfectly. We did not need to wait for an invitation. The two guards at the front pushed the massive doors open simultaneously, causing a loud echoing thud that instantly cut through the music. The jazz band faltered, ending their song on a sharp, discordant note. The sudden silence in the massive room was deafening. Hundreds of wealthy guests in custom tuxedos and designer gowns turned their heads toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold with Elias right beside me, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor before sinking into the plush carpet. The entire room froze in a collective state of shock. Right in the center of the dance floor stood Alana and Preston. They were posing perfectly for the photographers, holding a large silver knife together, hovering over a ridiculous 7-tier wedding cake covered in edible gold leaf. Alana had her perfect fake smile plastered across her face, but it melted away. The second she made eye contact with me, she lowered the knife, her mouth falling open. Preston narrowed his eyes, his arrogant smirk faltering as he took in the sight of my security team marching down the center aisle. I kept my eyes locked, straight ahead, cutting through the crowd like a knife. The guests parted for us instantly, stepping back and whispering frantically among themselves halfway across the room. My mother Vivian was holding court with a group of older, wealthy Chamberlain relatives. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, mid-air frozen like a statue. She did not look at me. Her eyes were completely fixated on the tall, intimidating figure walking next to me. Elias Thorne. Vivian knew exactly who he was. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her fingers trembled so violently that the expensive champagne sloshed over the rim of her glass and spilled onto her custom silk gown. She dropped the crystal flute, letting it shatter into dozens of sparkling pieces across the dance floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. The sound of the breaking glass broke the spell. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. "What is he doing here?" she shrieked, her voice completely devoid of its usual refined elite tone. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. Harrison rushed to her side, looking confused and furious, but Vivian pushed him away, pointing a shaking finger directly at Elias. "Get him out!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "Security. Get that man out of here right now. He is not supposed to be here. He is a threat to this family." The hotel's security guards stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom hesitated, looking confused by the sudden outburst. They started walking toward us, but my private tactical team instantly stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall between us and the approaching guards. The sheer size and professional stance of my team made the hotel staff stop dead in their tracks. They were not going to risk a physical altercation with elite contractors. Vivian was losing her mind. She grabbed the edge of a guest table, sending a centerpiece crashing to the floor. "Harrison, do something!" she yelled, hyperventilating, her carefully pinned hair falling loose around her face. "He is the executioner. He is going to ruin everything you promised me." This was secure. Harrison. Harrison looked completely bewildered, staring at Elias and then at me, having absolutely no idea about the legal nightmare standing in his rented ballroom. Alana abandoned the cake, leaving Preston behind as she ran over to our parents. "Mom, what is going on?" she cried, looking at Vivian, who was practically hyperventilating into her own hands. "Why is Maya back? And who are these men?" I ignored all of them. My gaze remained cold and indifferent. I nodded to Elias, who calmly walked past the broken glass and the terrified elite guests. He approached the main stage where the wedding band was still frozen in shock. He stepped onto the platform, his dark suit absorbing the bright spotlight. The lead singer nervously handed over the microphone and quickly backed away. Elias tapped the top of the microphone twice, the sharp thumping sound echoing through the massive ballroom speakers, commanding the absolute attention of every single person present. He looked down at my mother, who was still screaming for the hotel management to intervene. "Security works for the venue," Vivian Elias said, his deep baritone voice slicing through her hysterical screams, effortlessly. The entire room held its breath, hanging onto his every word. "And as of yesterday, my client owns this hotel." The collective gasp from 356 guests filled the room like a sudden vacuum. Preston dropped the cake knife entirely, his jaw tight with confusion and rising anger. Harrison stared at the stage, his eyes wide open, attempting to process the sheer magnitude of what the lawyer had just announced. Alana looked frantically from Preston to our parents, her perfect dream wedding rapidly morphing into a total nightmare. Vivian let out a low, agonizing wail, sinking onto a nearby chair, covering her face as the horrifying reality finally crushed her fragile fake empire. She knew exactly what Elias meant. She knew the protective bubble she had lived in for 3 years was officially bursting right in front of the very people she was trying to impress. I stood in the center of the room, perfectly calm, surrounded by the chaotic collapse of their social standing. I did not need to raise my voice or throw a tantrum. My mere presence and the legal authority of the man on that stage were enough to tear down everything they had built. I watched the wealthy guests pulling out their phones, recording the elite Jenkins family, completely unraveling. This was just the beginning of the financial execution. They had demanded my penthouse. Thinking I was nothing but tonight, they learned. Alana charged across the dance floor, dragging the heavy train of her custom silk wedding gown behind her like a deflated parachute. Her face was entirely twisted with a dark, ugly rage that completely shattered her carefully curated bridal perfection. She shoved past two wealthy guests, who were still staring at Elias, and planted herself directly in front of me. Her fists clenched so tightly, her knuckles turned pale white. "You are a sick, delusional liar," she screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed across the massive ballroom, causing the remaining guests to flinch backwards. "You are nothing but an antisocial freak who hides in dark rooms all day. You have been jealous of me since we were children. Grandmother Josephine hated you. She could not stand looking at your pathetic face. She cut you out of the will because you were a massive disappointment to the Jenkins name." Alana continued her hysterical rant, pacing back and forth, pointing an accusing finger at my face. "You hired this lawyer and these fake guards to come here and ruin the most important night of my life, because you are completely obsessed with destroying my happiness. Preston and I are building a real legacy, and you are just a pathetic data analyst trying to steal my spotlight. Hotel security is going to drag you out of here and throw you in a psych ward." I stood perfectly still, letting her exhaust her lungs. My expression remained completely neutral, which only seemed to infuriate her more. Vivian had collapsed onto a chair, sobbing loudly, while Harrison tried to physically block the Chamberlain family from leaving their table. But nobody was paying attention to my parents. Their eyes were glued to Alana, having a total psychological breakdown right in the middle of the dance floor. The elite society members she wanted to impress were pulling out their phones, recording every single embarrassing second of her public meltdown. Elias stepped forward calmly, bypassing my screaming sister. He raised his hand and gestured toward the far end of the ballroom, where the venue staff had set up massive digital projection screens earlier in the evening. Those screens were supposed to display a romantic montage of Alana and Preston traveling the world, showing off their fake glamorous lifestyle. Elias pulled a small black remote from his suit pocket. He pressed a single button without saying a word. The bright overhead chandeliers immediately dimmed, casting the grand ballroom into deep shadows. The sudden darkness forced Alana to stop screaming. She looked around frantically as the massive white screens descended from the ceiling, dropping down with a heavy mechanical hum. The venue sound system cracked to life, emitting a sharp burst of static that made the elite guests cover their ears. Then a face appeared on the giant screens, illuminating the entire room with a cold, bright glow. It was Grandmother Josephine. She was sitting in her private hospital room, exactly how she looked during her final days. The cancer had made her physically fragile, but her dark eyes burned with the same ruthless fire that had built our family empire. She wore a simple silk robe and sat up perfectly straight, her presence demanding absolute respect, even through a recorded video. The collective gasp from the Jenkins relatives in the room was deafening. Vivian let out another horrifying shriek, covering her eyes as if looking at a ghost from her worst nightmares. "My name is Josephine Jenkins." My grandmother's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, vibrating the crystal glasses on the tables. "I am recording this video diary to ensure my final wishes are completely understood, without any interference from the leeches who share my last name. I built this empire from nothing. I worked brutal hours in the Chicago logistics sector, dealing with cutthroat businessmen while raising a family. I built wealth through discipline, intelligence, and unrelenting hard work." The camera shifted slightly, capturing the cold, clinical walls of the hospital room before focusing back on her sharp features. "My son Harrison and his wife Vivian are an absolute disgrace to everything I stand for. They are obsessed with a hollow high society vanity, trying to impress a class of people who will never truly accept them. They drained resources to buy country club memberships and luxury vehicles while running the actual family business into the ground. They even tried to steal from the only person in this family with actual talent. And then there is my granddaughter Alana." My grandmother said, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. "A girl who has never worked a single honest day in her entire life. She spends her time curating a fake online persona, parading around Gold Coast boutiques, using money she never earned. She is lazy, entitled, and perfectly represents the toxic social climbing disease her mother infected this family with. She expects the world to be handed to her on a silver platter simply because she exists." The camera zoomed in slightly on my grandmother's face, her expression softening just a fraction as she delivered the final blow. "But Maya, my quiet observant, Maya, she is the only real Jenkins left. She inherited my mind, my work ethic, and my refusal to bend to the ridiculous expectations of high society. She built her own technology firm, while her family mocked her. She watched them squander opportunities while she accumulated real power. That is why I publicly cut her out of the will to protect her from their parasitic greed. Let this serve as my absolute final directive." My grandmother's voice echoed one last time, possessing a terrifying finality. "Everything I own, the trust, the real estate, the remaining liquidity goes entirely and exclusively to Maya Jenkins. Harrison, Vivian, and Alana are to receive absolutely nothing. They are entirely cut off. They can finally learn what it means to work for a living." The screen went black. The overhead chandeliers flickered back on, flooding the room with bright, blinding light. Alana stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, her wedding dress looking like a ridiculous costume. Preston's father stood up from his front row VIP table, his face turned a dark shade of red. His wife clutched her expensive designer handbag, looking absolutely repulsed by the people she had just shared a meal with. This is an absolute outrage. Raj, he bellowed, his voice thick with old money, arrogance, and deep-seated disgust. He pointed a trembling finger at Harrison. You led us to believe you were a family of substantial means. You are nothing but a group of penniless frauds, trying to scam your way into our family wealth. Preston, get your things. We demand an immediate annulment. You are not binding our legacy to this impoverished circus. The heavy silence that followed my grandmother. Final video declaration was shattered by the sound of a chair being violently pushed back against the marble floor. Richard Chamberlain, the father of Preston, stood up from his front row VIP table. His face was a dark, mottled shade of red that clashed terribly with his crisp white tuxedo shirt. He marched past the lavish floral centerpieces, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily across the dance floor, until he reached the edge of the stage. He did not ask for permission. He reached up and snatched a spare microphone from a microphone stand that one of the jazz musicians had abandoned earlier. Richard turned to face the crowd of horrified elite guests, his posture rigid with generations of old money arrogance. He gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles turning white as he glared down at my parents, who were still cowering near the deflated wedding cake. We were promised an alliance between equals. Richard bellowed, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom, vibrating with absolute fury. We opened our social circles and our pristine family legacy to the Jenkins family, because we were led to believe you possessed a certain pedigree and financial standing suitable for the Chamberlain name, but it is completely obvious now that we have been terribly deceived by a group of classless charlatans who crawled their way into the Gold Coast using stolen funds and cheap parlor tricks. Richard continued his racist tirade, pacing back and forth, his words laced with heavy coded language that every single person in the room understood perfectly well. You can dress up in designer gowns and rent out the Drake Hotel, but bloodlines do not lie, he sneered, looking at my father with utter contempt. You people lack the breeding, the civility, and the basic moral decency that is required to function in true high society. You are nothing but aggressive, unrefined imposters trying to infiltrate a world that will never truly accept you. My wife and I should have known better than to allow our son to associate with such a deeply flawed and volatile background. My father, Harrison, scrambled to his feet, his face dripping with nervous sweat, as he held his hands up in a desperate pleading gesture. Richard, please listen to me, he begged, his voice trembling with sheer panic. We can fix this. The logistics company still has value. We can negotiate a new contract. We can still merge our assets into the new portfolio. Just give me a chance to restructure the trust with the lawyers. We can make this work for both families, I promise you. Richard did not even let him finish his sentence. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that dripped with pure disdain. Merge what assets, Harrison? He mocked, pointing toward the giant projection screen that had just humiliated my entire family. You have absolutely nothing. Your own mother just exposed you as a pathetic thief who bankrupted his own business. You do not own this hotel, you do not own your mansion, and you do not even own the clothes on your back. You have nothing to offer the Chamberlain family. We are completely done here. The wealthy white guests sitting at the Chamberlain tables began nodding in agreement, whispering among themselves and looking at my family as if they were an infectious disease. Preston, who had been standing frozen near the destroyed wedding cake, suddenly snapped out of his shock. He spun around to face Alana, his eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating hatred. Alana reached out her hands, shaking violently, trying to grab onto the lapels of his expensive custom-tailored suit. Preston, please, she sobbed, hysterically, her fake eyelashes peeling off her tear-stained face. Baby, we can fight this in... My mother knows, judges. We can get the money back. We can still go on our honeymoon to Bora Bora tomorrow. Please do not let them ruin our perfect day. Preston slapped her hands away with a violent, aggressive motion, stepping backward as if her touch burned him. Do not touch me, you lying, penniless fraud, he shouted, his voice echoing right behind his father. Booming declaration. There is no honeymoon. Alana, there is no penthouse, and there is definitely no marriage. I am calling my legal team first thing tomorrow morning and filing for an immediate annulment. This entire wedding was a massive scam. You led me to believe you were inheriting $100 million trust fund. You told me your grandmother favored you over your sister. Alana fell to her knees, her massive silk wedding dress pooling around her like a collapsed white tent as she sobbed uncontrollably, begging Preston not to leave her in front of high society. Preston did not even look down at her. He stepped right over her expensive dress and began walking directly toward me. His jaw was clenched and his eyes burned with an arrogant fury. He stopped just 2 feet away from where I stood, surrounded by my private security team. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and his wealthy white privilege to intimidate me. You think you have won something tonight, do you not, Maya? Preston sneered, his voice low and dripping with absolute venom. You think, just because your crazy grandmother handed you a giant pile of cash, that you suddenly hold all the power in this room. You think stealing a penthouse makes you someone important. He let out a dark, condescending chuckle, shaking his head. You are nothing but new money trash. Maya, you could buy 100 penthouses on the Gold Coast, and you will still just be an awkward, pathetic data analyst playing dress-up. Preston took another step forward, ignoring the warning glance from my head of security. The Chamberlain legacy is built on centuries of untouchable wealth and actual institutional power, Preston bragged, pointing a finger at my chest. You cannot buy your way into our world. We control the country clubs, we control the boardrooms, and we control the social registry in Chicago. By tomorrow morning, my father and I will make sure you are completely blacklisted from every single elite circle in this city. Your grandmother money means absolutely nothing when nobody who matters will ever do business with you. I stood perfectly still, letting his arrogant threats wash over me. Without blinking a single time, I did not flinch, I did not argue back, and I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I simply stared right into his angry, privileged eyes, maintaining a calm, calculating gaze that made his confident smirk falter. Just a tiny fraction. I let the heavy silence stretch between us, allowing his racist, elitist rant to hang in the air for everyone to hear. Then I moved. I stepped smoothly past Preston, brushing my shoulder against his custom suit jacket, leaving him standing there looking confused. I walked straight toward the main stage, my security team seamlessly parting to let me through, leaving my ruined family, crying on the dance floor. I climbed the short stairs onto the platform, my heels clicking against the wooden boards. Elias stood waiting for me with a knowing smile. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his hand. I opened my black designer bag and pulled out the second red folder, the one containing the heavy financial documents that would bring the Chamberlain empire to its knees. I looked down from the stage, locking my eyes directly on Preston, who had turned around to watch me. I tapped the microphone once and spoke with ice-cold precision. I was waiting for you to say exactly that, Preston. I stood on the elevated stage, looking down at the red-faced patriarch of the Chamberlain family and his equally arrogant son. The entire ballroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents high above us. I opened the heavy red folder, tracing my finger over the top page of the thick stack of financial documents. I pulled the microphone closer to my mouth, making sure my voice would project perfectly into every single corner of the massive room, leaving no room for anyone to miss a single syllable. You talk a lot about legacy, Richard, I said, projecting my voice to reach the very back tables where the oldest and wealthiest guests were sitting frozen in their seats. You talk about your pristine bloodlines, your institutional power, and your centuries of untouchable wealth. You look down your nose at my parents, calling them penniless frauds, trying to scam their way into your precious family wealth. It is truly a fascinating performance you put on tonight, Richard, it really is. But there is just one massive problem with your elitist speech. I pulled out the first official document from the red folder and held it high under the bright stage lights for everyone to see. The Chamberlain legacy is completely dead. It died a decade ago, and you have been dragging its rotting corpse around Chicago, hoping nobody would notice the terrible smell. Richard Chamberlain took a sudden step back, his jaw dropping open. Preston lost all the color in his face, looking exactly like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. I looked down at the financial summary sheet, reading the catastrophic numbers out loud for everyone to hear. Your family empire is currently drowning in exactly $40 million of toxic commercial debt. Richard, your historic hotels, the ones you brag about at every single country club dinner, are leveraged to the absolute breaking point. You have taken out third and fourth mortgages on properties that are literally crumbling to the ground. You have maxed out every single corporate credit line available to you, and your offshore accounts are completely empty. You are not old money, Richard. You are just old debt. The wealthy guests in the ballroom started murmuring loudly, shifting in their seats and pulling out their phones to text their financial advisors. Preston pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain his superior facade. "Shut your mouth, Maya," he yelled, looking around frantically at his high society friends. "She is making all of this up. She is just a bitter, jealous liar trying to ruin our flawless reputation. Do not listen to a single word. She says she is completely insane." I slowly turned my gaze to Preston, letting a cold, knowing smile spread across my face. "I am not making anything up, Preston. I have the certified bank statements, the foreclosure warnings, and the desperate emails your father sent to private equity firms begging for a massive bailout. Right here in my hand." I pulled out a stack of printed emails and tossed them off the edge of the stage. They fluttered down, landing right at Preston's feet. "You did not fall in love with my sister, Preston. You fell in love with a massive delusion." I looked over at Alana, who was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the massive pile of white silk from her ruined custom wedding dress. She was staring at Preston with wide, terrified eyes. "You only proposed to Alana because you hired a private investigator to look into the Jenkins family finances." I continued exposing his entire pathetic scheme to the crowd. "Your investigator found out about grandmother Josephine and her master trust. You thought Alana was the golden child who was going to inherit $100 million. You thought marrying her was your golden ticket out of bankruptcy. You needed my grandmother money to bail your failing family out of a $40 million hole and save your father from going to federal prison for financial fraud." The collective gasp from the elite audience was so loud it echoed against the crystal chandeliers above. Alana slowly pushed herself up off the floor, her hands trembling violently as she looked from me to Preston. She shook her head back and forth, refusing to believe the reality crashing down around her. "Preston, is that true?" she asked, her voice nothing but a hollow, desperate whisper. "Tell me she is lying. Preston, tell me you actually love me and you are not completely broke." Preston did not even look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the legal documents scattered on the floor, his chest heaving with panic. His father, Richard, was gripping the edge of a guest table, looking like he was about to pass out from the sheer humiliation of being exposed in front of the exact people he had spent years pretending to be richer than the truth was out. And there was absolutely nowhere for them to hide their shame. "My mother." Vivian suddenly let out a loud, hysterical laugh that sounded like cracking glass. She pointed a shaking finger at Richard and Preston. "You broke, pathetic losers!" She screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged, making the guests flinch. "You were trying to use us. You were trying to scam my daughter out of her inheritance to save your sinking ship. We thought we were marrying into royalty, and you are nothing but a bunch of broke white trash trying to steal our wealth." Richard Chamberlain's face turned purple with pure rage, and he lunged forward, pointing right back at Vivian. "You delusional woman," he roared, losing every ounce of his refined country club etiquette. "What wealth? You have absolutely nothing. Your own daughter just told the entire world that you are living on her charity. You tried to use us for our social standing and our family name. We needed cash and you needed a title. We were both playing the exact same game, but you were too stupid to realize we were both holding empty hands." I stood on the stage, watching the absolute absurdity of the situation unfold right in front of me. It was the most beautiful poetic justice I could have ever imagined. Two horribly toxic, narcissistic families, who spent their entire lives obsessed with status and wealth, had just collided in a spectacular explosion of mutual deception. They had spent months planning this lavish $200,000 wedding, faking smiles and giving grand speeches about combining two powerful dynasties. Alana thought Preston was her billionaire savior coming to whisk her away to a life of endless luxury and high society privilege. Preston thought Alana was his billionaire savior, coming to inject massive amounts of liquid cash into his dying family empire. They were two gold diggers trying to dig for gold in a completely empty mine. They had successfully scammed each other, And now the brutal truth was laid bare for all of Chicago high society to witness and mock. The realization washed over both families, simultaneously creating a chaotic symphony of screaming, pointing, and vicious accusations. Alana grabbed a handful of frosting from the destroyed wedding cake and hurled it directly at Preston, ruining his expensive tuxedo shirt. Preston called Alana a useless parasite, while Vivian and Richard screamed horrible insults at each other across the dance floor, tearing down every last shred of dignity they had left. They were completely broke, exposed, and humiliated, fighting over phantom money, while I watched them destroy each other from the high ground, holding the absolute power to crush their lives. Richard Chamberlain abruptly stopped screaming at my mother and turned his furious gaze back toward the stage. His chest was heaving, and his face was slick with sweat from the humiliating public spectacle. He raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You listen to me, you vicious little liar!" He bellowed, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "My family has been a pillar of Chicago high society for 4 generations. We have survived economic depressions and market crashes. You think you can just march in here with some forged documents and destroy our pristine reputation? I have the most ruthless legal team in the state of Illinois on retainer, and I am going to sue you for every single penny your crazy grandmother left you. I will drag you through civil court for defamation, slander, and emotional distress until you are begging to sleep on the streets." Preston immediately backed up his father, puffing out his chest and stepping closer to the stage. "You are going down, Maya," he yelled, his voice cracking slightly with desperate panic. "My father is right. You completely fabricated these financial records because you are obsessed with ruining my wedding day. Nobody in this room believes your ridiculous story. The Chamberlain Hotel Group is a bedrock institution in this city. You are just a pathetic data analyst, playing dress-up with fake printed emails. Our lawyers are going to shred you to pieces and take that $5 million penthouse as compensation for the immense psychological damage you just caused us." I stood on the stage looking down at the 2 desperate men trying to threaten me with non-existent power. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I did not need to raise my voice or scream like they did. True power never has to shout. I simply leaned into the microphone and let my calm, steady voice wash over the panicked crowd. "You are not going to sue me, Richard," I said, my words slicing through his arrogant threats like a razor blade. His face twitched in confusion as he tried to comprehend my absolute lack of fear. "Oh, we are definitely going to sue you," Preston interrupted aggressively. "We are going to destroy your entire pathetic life." I shook my head slowly, looking at Preston with nothing but pure, unfiltered pity. "You cannot sue me, Preston," I said softly, leaning forward over the edge of the stage, "because you cannot sue your lender." The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The rich guests stopped whispering and leaned in, closer, trying to understand the massive shift in power that was happening right in front of their eyes. Richard Chamberlain lowered his pointing finger, his mouth opening and closing, as his brain struggled to process the terrifying implications of my words. I opened the red folder again, pulling out the final document, the one with the heavy gold corporate seal stamped at the bottom. "Let me formally introduce myself," I announced, my voice projecting with absolute authority. "You keep calling me a low-level data analyst and antisocial freak hiding in a cubicle, but that was just the cover story I needed to operate in the shadows, without your greedy family noticing my actual movements. My name is Maya Jenkins, and I am the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital FinTech." The gasps from the elite financial executives in the crowd were immediate and dramatic. Apex Capital was known throughout the Chicago financial sector as a ruthless, predatory investment firm that specialized in acquiring distressed commercial real estate debt. They were the invisible sharks of the Gold Coast, and none of these arrogant socialites had any idea that a 31-year-old black woman was the apex predator running the entire operation. I looked directly at Richard, who was now physically shaking, holding onto the back of a chair to keep himself from collapsing. 3 days ago, I continued driving the final nail into his coffin. Apex Capital aggressively bought out your entire $40 million debt portfolio. We purchased the third mortgages on your historic hotels. We bought the defaulted corporate credit lines, and we bought the personal guarantees you and your son signed when you desperately tried to keep your fake empire afloat. We bought your debt for pennies on the dollar because your creditors knew you were a completely lost cause. Preston staggered backward, gripping his head in his hands, as the horrifying reality finally crushed his elite ego. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No. That is impossible. Apex is a massive corporate entity. You cannot be the CEO, you are just Alana's socially awkward sister. This cannot be happening. It is happening right now." "Preston," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead into his panicked gaze. "I did not just crash your fake wedding to expose your bankruptcy. I came here to execute the total financial takeover of the Chamberlain family. You thought you could use my sister to get to my grandmother trust fund to bail yourselves out, but you walked right into a massive trap that I have been carefully setting for months." I walked down the steps of the stage, stepping right up to Preston, my security team seamlessly moving with me, forming a protective half-circle. I stopped just inches from his face, smelling the expensive cologne mingling with his cold, nervous sweat. He tried to look down at me, trying to hold on to his crumbling white privilege, but I owned him completely, and we both knew it. I stared dead into Preston's eyes, watching his arrogant soul fracture into a million pieces. "I do not just own the penthouse you wanted as your precious wedding gift, Preston," I whispered, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm pitch. "I own your parents' entire estate. I own your completely drained trust fund. I own the luxury cars you drove here tonight. And if I decide to call in your personal debts tomorrow morning, I will legally own the very suit on your back." I let the words hang in the air, watching Preston Chamberlain, the boy who had just called me new money trash, realize that his entire existence was now completely at the mercy of the woman he had spent the last 2 hours insulting. The absolute reality of my words finally crushed whatever was left of Preston Chamberlain and his fragile ego. He slowly turned his body away from the stage, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He looked down at Alana, who was still sitting on the floor, drowning in the white silk of her ruined wedding gown. She reached out her hand toward him, her face a messy mask of smeared makeup and desperate tears. "Preston," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the loud murmurs of the wealthy guests. "We can fix this. We can just talk to Maya. She is my sister. She will not actually do this to us." Preston let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a vicious growl. He slapped her hand away so violently that she fell backward onto the marble floor. "You stupid, pathetic parasite!" Preston screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. "You lied to me from the very beginning. You paraded around Gold Coast boutiques acting like you were some kind of billionaire heiress. You let me buy you expensive dinners and luxury vacations, thinking you were going to bail my family out of our financial ruin. You knew exactly what you were doing. You played me for an absolute fool just to get a diamond ring and a country club membership." Alana scrambled to her feet, her own anger finally bubbling up through her panic, breaking her delicate socialite facade. "I lied to you," she shrieked back, pointing a shaking finger directly at his chest. "You are the one who has been dragging a dead family legacy around Chicago, pretending to be a wealthy aristocrat. You broke, pathetic loser. You needed my grandmother to pay off your massive debts. You are nothing but a gold digger wearing a cheap rented tuxedo." Alana grabbed a half-full glass of vintage champagne from the nearest guest table and hurled the liquid directly into Preston. The expensive alcohol splashed across his eyes and dripped down his crisp white shirt, ruining the very fabric I had just threatened to take from him. Preston wiped his eyes, letting out a furious roar. He lunged forward, but his father Richard grabbed him by the shoulder, pulling him back before he could do something that would land him in a police car. The wealthy elite guests sitting around the dance floor did not try to stop the fight or offer any sympathy. Instead, every single one of them pulled out their smartphones. The bright flashes of cameras illuminated the ballroom as Chicago high society recorded the spectacular downfall of two prominent families. The Chamberlain relatives, who had been sitting with perfect posture just minutes ago, were now whispering frantically to each other, pointing at Preston and covering their mouths in shock. Preston mother, a fragile woman who had spent the entire evening looking down her nose at everyone suddenly clutched her chest. She let out a weak, dramatic gasp as the sheer humiliation of being exposed as penniless frauds in front of her country club friends finally overwhelmed her system. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed backward, fainting completely, dead away into the arms of a terrified groomsman. Richard Chamberlain abandoned his screaming match with my parents and rushed to his unconscious wife, slapping her cheeks and yelling for someone to call an ambulance. But the chaos was so deafening that nobody even moved to help them. The collapse of the Chamberlain family was only half of the entertainment. My own parents had completely lost whatever shred of sanity they had left. Harrison turned his absolute fury onto Vivian, his face purple with a lifetime of repressed resentment. "This is entirely your fault," Vivian Harrison roared, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of losing his mansion, his cars, and his fake reputation. "You pushed for this ridiculous wedding you demanded. We drained the company accounts to buy her. Ridiculous dresses and host this $200,000 circus. You told me Maya was just a stupid anti-social data analyst who would never figure out what we were doing. You made me ignore my own flesh and blood just to chase after these bankrupt white elitists because you are utterly obsessed with social climbing." Vivian did not back down. She stepped right up to Harrison, pounding her fists against his chest, making him stumble backward. "Do not you dare blame this on me, you incompetent coward." Vivian shrieked, her voice scraping against the walls of the venue. "You ran the logistics company into the ground because you are terrible at business. You needed Maya College Fund to save yourself from federal prison. You are the one who agreed to forge her signature on the loan documents 5 years ago. You spineless failure. I only tried to secure our future because my husband was too stupid to make actual money. I was just trying to protect our lifestyle while you sat in your office drinking bourbon and pretending to be a successful executive. You ruined this family, Harrison. You ruined everything." Harrison grabbed Vivian by the shoulders, shaking her violently, right in front of the recording guests. "I was building a legacy," he yelled back, spit flying from his mouth. "I was trying to keep a roof over your greedy head. You are a toxic parasite. Vivian, you poisoned Alana, turning her into a useless gold digger, and you drove away the only daughter who actually had a brain in her head. Maya was the golden goose, and you slapped her across the face because you could not control your pathetic temper. You literally beat our billionaire daughter out the door, you stupid, arrogant woman." I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, watching the absolute carnage unfold below me. It was a beautiful symphony of destruction. The fake alliances they had built on lies and stolen money were burning to ash right in front of my eyes. Elias Thorne stepped up beside me, his hands resting casually inside the pockets of his tailored suit. He looked down at the screaming, crying families with a mild expression of professional boredom. The private security team maintained their strict perimeter, ensuring none of the violence spilled over onto the stage or threatened my physical safety. The venue staff were hiding in the hallways, terrified to intervene in the massive high society brawl. I felt a sudden profound sense of peace wash over my mind, the heavy suffocating weight I had carried for 31 years, the constant feeling of never being good enough. The endless criticism and the emotional neglect completely evaporated from my shoulders. They were no longer my family, and they were no longer my problem. They were just desperate strangers, tearing each other apart over phantom wealth. I turned away from the screaming match and walked over to a small serving table set up near the back of the stage. I picked up a crystal glass filled with ice, cold sparkling water. I walked back to the edge of the stage, taking a slow, refreshing sip. The cool liquid slid down my throat, perfectly, matching the ice-cold victory, pumping through my veins. I watched my mother crying on the floor, my father screaming at the ceiling, and my sister rolling around in ruined silk, completely unbothered by their spectacular demise. The heavy weight of the ultimatum hung in the air, pressing down on my parents. Like a physical force, Harrison seemed completely paralyzed, his eyes darting wildly between the pristine white envelope in Elias' hand and the impassive faces of my private security team. He knew there was absolutely no escape from the corner he had painted himself into. Federal prison was no longer just an abstract concept. It was a very real, terrifying destination. Waiting for him at the end of the weekend, Vivian, however, reacted differently. The sheer arrogant pride that had defined her entire existence finally snapped under the immense pressure of losing everything she had ever valued. The elegant, sophisticated socialite facade she had spent decades meticulously crafting dissolved into absolute pathetic desperation. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of her massive custom silk gown, and she collapsed directly onto the cold, hard marble floor of the ballroom, right at my feet. She did not care that the wealthy Chamberlain family was watching her. She did not care that the elite country club members had their smartphone cameras pointed right at her face. The only thing that mattered to her now was pure, terrified survival. Vivian reached out with her trembling, manicured hands and grabbed the bottom hem of my simple black dress, clutching the fabric so tightly. Her knuckles turned a pale, ghostly white. "Maya, please," she wailed, her voice cracking into a raw, agonizing sob that echoed off the crystal chandeliers above us. "Please do not do this to us. You cannot send us to federal prison. We would not survive a single day in a place like that. You are my daughter, my own flesh and blood. I carried you inside me for 9 months. I gave birth to you. I endured hours of agonizing labor just to bring you into this world. You cannot do this to your own mother. It is an unforgivable sin to destroy the woman who gave you life." I stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from solid ice, looking down at the hysterical woman groveling on the floor. Her tears were ruining her expensive designer makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks of mascara running down her cheeks, dripping onto the collar of her gown. She tugged at my dress again, burying her face into the fabric, weeping loudly and begging for a mercy she had never once shown me in my entire 31 years of existence. She tried to weaponize the very concept of motherhood, using biology as a desperate shield to protect herself from the legal consequences of her own massive criminal fraud. Would magically erase a lifetime of emotional neglect, psychological abuse, and extreme financial manipulation. I did not try to pull my dress away from her desperate grip. I just stared down at the top of her perfectly styled hair, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness where a daughter love was supposed to be. I slowly reached my right hand up to my own face, bringing my fingertips to rest gently against my cheek. The skin there was still burning hot, tender and swollen from the brutal slap she had delivered just an hour earlier. The physical pain was still throbbing, acting as a constant rhythmic reminder of exactly how much she truly hated me when I refused to comply with her toxic social climbing demands. I let my fingers trace the raised red mark, feeling the slight stinging sensation, while I listened to her pathetic whimpering on the floor. "You gave birth to me." "Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm pitch that forced her to stop sobbing and look up at my face. "You brought me into this world, but you never actually acted like a mother. You spent my entire childhood treating me like a massive burden. You constantly compared me to Alana, making sure I always felt inferior and completely unworthy of love. You drained my entire college fund, destroying my future, just to save Harrison, failing business, and then you forced me to take out massive student loans while you bought your golden child a brand new luxury car. You lied to your wealthy friends about my career because you were deeply ashamed of my independence. And tonight, when you realized I would not hand over my home to fund your pathetic charade, you struck me across the face with the full force of your hatred." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, to formulate another desperate excuse, but the words died in her throat as I crouched down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers. My eyes locked dead into her terrified gaze, preventing her from looking away. "I am not doing anything to you, Vivian," I continued, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You and Harrison did this to yourselves. You committed felony wire fraud. You forged my signature on federal banking documents, and you stole $2 million to fund a fake, luxurious lifestyle. You created your own destruction, and now you get to face the brutal consequences of your own greed." I slowly stood back up to my full height, towering over her kneeling figure. I brushed my fingertips against my burning cheek one final time before letting my arm drop to my side. This slap, I announced, my voice projecting clearly so that every single person in the quiet ballroom could hear the absolute finality of my decision. This slap paid off. Whatever remaining maternal debt I owed you. Our ledger is completely clear, and the biological contract is officially terminated. We are no longer family. Vivian, we are just a victim and a perpetrator. I turned my head and looked at the commander of my private tactical security team, who was standing at strict attention just a few feet away. The commander met my eyes, waiting for the final directive escort. These two individuals out of my hotel. Immediately I commanded, pointing a steady finger toward my parents. Do not let them gather any belongings. Do not let them speak to any other guests. March them directly out the service exit and throw them onto the street. They have exactly 24 hours to sign the forfeiture. Documents with Elias or the Federal Bureau of Investigation gets the forged loan files. The suffocating weight of Elias Thorne and his brutal ultimatum pressed down on the grand ballroom like an invisible crushing force. Harrison stood completely paralyzed, his arms hanging limply at his sides, as his eyes darted frantically between the pristine white envelope containing his criminal forgery and the cold, impassive faces of my private security team. He knew with absolute certainty that there was no legal loophole, no clever business negotiation, and no manipulative charm that could save him from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His entire fake empire had evaporated, leaving him standing as nothing more than a terrified old man facing a mandatory minimum prison sentence. But my mother Vivian reacted entirely differently. The immense arrogant pride that had defined every single breathing moment of her adult life finally fractured and snapped under the terrifying pressure of losing her precious social status. The elegant, sophisticated high society facade she had spent decades meticulously crafting dissolved into a puddle of absolute pathetic desperation. Her knees physically buckled beneath the heavy weight of her massive custom designer silk gown. She collapsed forward, falling directly onto the cold, hard marble floor of the dance floor, landing right at the tips of my black heels. She did not care that Richard Chamberlain and his old money relatives were watching her with supreme disgust. She did not care that the elite country club members she had spent years trying to impress currently had their smartphone cameras pointed directly at her tear-streaked face. The only thing that mattered to her in this horrifying moment was pure, terrified survival. Vivian reached out with her trembling, manicured hands, her expensive diamond rings catching the bright stage lights, and she grabbed the bottom hem of my simple black dress. She clutched the dark fabric so tightly that her knuckles turned a pale, ghostly white, pulling on my skirt like a desperate drowning woman grasping at a life raft. "Maya, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking into a raw, agonizing sob that echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers hanging high above us. "Please do not do this to us. You cannot send your own parents to a federal prison. You are my daughter Maya. You are my own flesh and blood. I carried you inside my body for 9 long months. I gave birth to you. I endured hours of agonizing physical labor just to bring you into this world. You cannot do this to your own mother. It is an absolute, unforgivable sin to destroy the woman who literally gave you life." She continued her hysterical sobbing, pressing her forehead against my knees, wetting the fabric of my dress with her makeup and her desperate tears, shedding every last ounce of the dignity she used to constantly lecture me about. She actually thought invoking the sacred title of mother would magically erase a lifetime of emotional neglect, psychological abuse, and extreme financial manipulation. She thought reminding me of my birth would make me forget how she had treated me like a repulsive burden every single day since I was old enough to walk. I stood perfectly still, looking down at her kneeling figure, feeling absolutely nothing resembling love or sympathy. There was just a profound, hollow emptiness inside my chest where a normal daughterly affection was supposed to be. I did not try to pull my dress away from her desperate grip. I just stared down at the top of her perfectly styled hair, watching the expensive hairpins slowly slide out of place as she groveled on the floor like a common beggar. The wealthy guests in the room watched in stunned, absolute silence, completely paralyzed by the sheer rawness of a Gold Coast matriarch begging for mercy from the daughter she had publicly humiliated just an hour ago. Nobody dared to whisper a single word. I slowly raised my right hand, bringing my fingertips up to rest gently against my own cheek. The skin there was still burning hot, extremely tender, and noticeably swollen from the brutal, vicious slap she had delivered when I refused to sign over my penthouse. The physical pain was still throbbing, acting as a constant rhythmic reminder of exactly how much she truly hated me when I refused to comply with her toxic social climbing demands. I let my fingers trace the raised red mark, feeling the slight stinging sensation while I listened to her pathetic whimpering on the floor. "You gave birth to me, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm pitch that forced her to abruptly stop sobbing and look up at my face. "You brought me into this world, but you never actually acted like a real mother. You spent my entire childhood treating me like a massive, embarrassing burden. You constantly compared me to Alana, making sure I always felt fundamentally inferior and completely unworthy of basic human affection. You drained my entire college fund, destroying my educational future just to save Harrison, failing business, and then you forced me to take out massive student loans while you bought your golden child, a brand new luxury car. You lied to your wealthy friends about my career because you were deeply ashamed of my independence. And tonight, when you realized I would not hand over my home to fund your pathetic charade, you struck me across the face with the full force of your absolute hatred." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, to formulate another desperate excuse about wanting the best for the family. But the words died in her throat as I crouched down, slightly bringing my face closer to hers. My eyes locked dead into her terrified gaze, preventing her from looking away. "I am not doing anything to you, Vivian." I continued, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "And Harrison did this to yourselves. You committed felony wire fraud, you forged my signature on federal banking documents, and you stole $2 million to fund a fake luxurious lifestyle. You created your own destruction, and now you get to face the brutal consequences of your own greed." I slowly stood back up to my full height, towering over her kneeling figure. I brushed my fingertips against my burning cheek one final time before letting my arm drop to my side. "This slap," I announced, my voice projecting clearly so that every single person in the quiet ballroom could hear the absolute finality of my decision. "This slap paid off whatever remaining maternal debt I owed you. Our ledger is completely clear, and the biological contract is officially terminated. We are no longer family. Vivian, we are just a victim and a perpetrator." I turned my head and looked at the commander of my private tactical security team, who was standing at strict attention, just a few feet away. The commander met my eyes, waiting for the final directive: escort these two individuals out of my hotel. Immediately I commanded, pointing a steady finger toward my parents. "Do not let them gather any belongings. Do not let them speak to any other guests. March them directly out the service exit and throw them onto the street. They have exactly 24 hours to sign the forfeiture documents with Elias, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation gets the forged loan files." The crisp morning air of the Chicago Gold Coast usually carried the scent of fresh espresso and expensive landscaping. But at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the atmosphere outside the Jenkins mansion was thick with absolute devastation. I stood across the street, leaning against the sleek black exterior of my Maybach, watching the mechanical execution of my final directive. A fleet of massive white moving trucks was parked directly on the pristine cobblestone driveway, completely blocking the entrance. My private corporate security team had already formed a tight perimeter around the property, standing with their arms crossed, looking like an impenetrable wall of dark suits. The wealthy neighbors were already peeking through their custom silk curtains, holding their morning coffee cups, and watching the unprecedented spectacle unfold right in the middle of their exclusive gated community. Inside the mansion, the reality of my absolute financial control was hitting my family with the force of a freight train. Elias had arrived precisely at dawn with the legal forfeiture documents, forcing my parents to sign away every single asset to avoid federal prison. They had agreed to my terms, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes they could physically carry out of the house. Vivian and Alana had immediately rushed upstairs to their massive walk-in closets, planning to pack their expensive designer gowns and custom jewelry into their set of luxury leather luggage. They thought they could sneak away with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of high fashion. But my security commander stopped them right at the top of the grand staircase. The commander calmly informed them that every single piece of designer luggage, every luxury handbag, and every piece of jewelry had been purchased using funds from the master trust, which meant all of it legally belonged to my corporate entity. They were not allowed to take a single leather bag out of that house instead. The security team handed my mother and my sister a stack of cheap, heavy-duty black plastic trash bags, the kind you buy at a discount hardware store. I watched through the massive front windows as Vivian stared at the rolled-up plastic bags, her hands shaking with pure disbelief. She actually tried to argue with the security guards, demanding her custom monogrammed suitcases, but the guards just pointed toward the front door, offering no sympathy. The sheer humiliation of stuffing their clothes into garbage bags finally broke whatever fragile composure they had left. Vivian and Alana were forced to shove their dresses, shoes, and basic toiletries into the crinkling black plastic, dragging them down the expensive hardwood stairs like common scavengers. The sound of the plastic bags scraping against the floor echoed through the empty mansion, serving as the perfect soundtrack to their spectacular downfall. The front doors opened and my security team marched them out into the bright morning sunlight. Alana emerged first, carrying two bulging trash bags over her shoulder. Her face was completely devoid of makeup, her eyes red and swollen from crying all night long. The second, Alana stepped onto the manicured front lawn. She saw the neighbors watching her from their driveways. The elite socialites she had spent years trying to impress were witnessing her getting evicted with garbage bags. Alana dropped the plastic bags onto the grass and let out a loud, agonizing scream. She fell to her knees right in the middle of the yard, ripping handfuls of green grass from the ground and sobbing hysterically. She screamed about losing her wedding. She screamed about losing Preston, and she screamed about how her entire life was ruined. She begged the neighbors to help her, reaching out toward the street. But the wealthy residents simply turned their heads and walked back into their mansions, refusing to associate with a family of exposed frauds. Alana was experiencing the exact same brutal social rejection she had inflicted on me for 31 years, and it was absolutely glorious to witness. Harrison walked out of the house a few minutes later, dragging his own trash bags behind him. He looked like a completely hollow shell of the arrogant man who had tried to intimidate me the night before. His shoulders were slumped and his posture was completely defeated, but his survival instincts were still trying to fight the inevitable. He dropped his bags next to Vivian, who was standing on the lawn, looking completely catatonic. Harrison pulled out his smartphone, stepping away from the crying woman to make a series of desperate phone calls. He paced back and forth across the driveway, dialing number after number, trying to reach his old golf buddies, his country club associates, and the private investors he had known for decades. I watched him hold the phone to his ear, his face growing more and more panicked with every single unanswered call. He was trying to secure a last-minute bailout, begging for a temporary loan, or just a place to stay for the weekend, but nobody was picking up the phone. The wealthy elite of Chicago are fiercely protective of their money, and news travels faster than light in the financial district. They all knew the Jenkins family was completely bankrupt and nobody was going to risk their own capital to save a sinking ship. Harrison finally managed to get one person on the line, an old banking executive he had known since college. I could see the desperate hope flash across my father's face as he started talking frantically, waving his hands and pleading, but the hope vanished almost instantly, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated horror. Harrison stopped pacing his body, going completely rigid. The banking executive was not offering him a loan. He was delivering a terrifying message I had specifically asked Lauren to prepare. I had my firm Apex Capital send out a priority financial bulletin to every single major bank, credit union, and private equity firm in the greater Chicago area, placing Harrison and Vivian Jenkins on an absolute strict corporate blacklist warning. The entire financial sector that any institution doing business with them would face immediate aggressive debt acquisition from my company. Harrison slowly lowered the phone from his ear, staring blankly at the dark screen. He finally understood the true magnitude of my power. I had not just taken his house and his money. I had completely erased his ability to ever rebuild his life in this city. He was financially radioactive, untouchable, and isolated from the business world. He had worshipped his entire life. He looked across the street, his defeated eyes finally locking onto mine as I leaned against the Maybach. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply offered him a slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging his total, absolute destruction. The moving trucks began to start their engines, ready to transport the seized assets to my storage facilities, leaving my parents and my sister standing on the sidewalk, clutching their cheap plastic garbage bags with absolutely nowhere to go. While my parents were dragging trash bags across their manicured lawn, Preston Chamberlain was experiencing his own unique brand of absolute destruction on the other side of the city. The Chamberlain corporate headquarters was a massive historic limestone building located right in the heart of the Chicago Loop. It had stood there for 4 generations, serving as a towering monument to their old money-white privilege and their supposed untouchable financial power. It was the physical representation of everything they used to look down on my family. Preston pulled his rented sports car up to the curb, expecting the usual valet to greet him and open his door with a respectful bow. Instead, he found the broad concrete sidewalk completely swarming with people in chaos. Preston stepped out of the car, straightening his designer tie, trying to project an air of absolute authority, despite the massive hangover of humiliation he was suffering from last night. As he pushed his way through the growing crowd on the sidewalk, he finally saw what everyone was staring at. The massive brass and glass revolving doors of the Chamberlain building were wrapped in thick, heavy industrial chains and secured with giant steel padlocks. Bright neon orange notices from the federal bankruptcy court were plastered across the pristine glass panes. A team of private corporate auditors wearing dark suits with Apex Capital badges pinned to their lapels were standing guard by the service entrance. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs were carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes out of the building, loading them directly into waiting armored transport trucks. They were seizing decades of fraudulent financial records, fake accounting ledgers, and hidden offshore account details that proved his father had been running a massive corporate scam. Preston felt all the blood drain from his face as he marched right up to the service entrance, demanding to be let inside. He puffed out his chest, trying to look down at the Apex Capital auditors standing on the loading dock. "I am Preston Chamberlain, the vice president of this acquisitions firm," he barked, pointing a shaking finger at the nearest auditor. "You have absolutely no right to be here. Open these doors right now, or I will have you all arrested for corporate trespassing." The lead auditor did not even blink. He simply looked Preston up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. "You are not the vice president of anything, Preston," the auditor said, his voice completely devoid of any respect. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, Apex Capital executed the hostile takeover of this entire building and all its subsidiary assets. You are currently trespassing on our private property. I highly suggest you step back before I ask the federal agents to remove you by force." The absolute reality of losing his family empire finally hit Preston square in the jaw. He stumbled backward away from the service entrance just as a local news van pulled up to the curb, screeching to a sudden halt. A prominent financial reporter for a major Chicago news network jumped out of the van, followed closely by a cameraman carrying a heavy broadcasting rig. The reporter spotted Preston instantly and sprinted across the sidewalk, shoving a microphone directly into his pale, sweating face. "Preston Chamberlain," the reporter shouted, trying to be heard over the chaotic noise of the busy downtown street. "Is it true that your family empire has been bankrupt for a decade? Sources are saying you tried to scam the wealthy Jenkins family out of a $100 million trust fund by staging a fake wedding last night. Can you confirm that Apex Capital just liquidated your entire hotel portfolio to pay off $40 million of toxic debt?" The rapid-fire questions hit Preston like physical blows, exposing his deepest, darkest secrets to the morning commuter crowd. The camera lens was shoved right into his face, capturing every single bead of sweat rolling down his forehead and the frantic, terrified look in his eyes. The perfectly manicured society boy had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide his shame. Preston completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. His pristine old money facade shattered into a million sharp pieces, revealing the violent, desperate coward hiding underneath. "Get that camera out of my face, you pathetic bottom feeder," Preston roared, his voice cracking into a vicious feral scream. He lunged forward with both hands flying through the air and violently shoved the cameraman backward. The heavy broadcasting camera slammed against the brick exterior of the building, with a loud, sickening crunch shattering the expensive lens completely. Preston did not stop there. He grabbed the reporter by the collar of his suit jacket, shaking him wildly and screaming horrible elitist insults right in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. Two federal agents who were busy loading boxes into the armored trucks immediately dropped their cargo and sprinted toward the violent altercation. They tackled Preston from behind, driving his face directly into the dirty concrete sidewalk right next to a puddle of stagnant street water. Preston thrashed and kicked, screaming about his pedigree and his family name, but the agents easily pinned his arms behind his back. They did not care about his country club memberships or his supposed generational wealth. To them, he was just another violent, desperate man throwing a public tantrum because his financial crimes had finally caught up with him. The reporter scrambled backward, fixing his crooked tie while looking down at the disgraced aristocrat with a triumphant smile. The footage of Preston Chamberlain violently assaulting a journalist while his family business was raided by federal agents was already uploading to the network servers, destined to be the top story on the morning news cycle. The agents eventually pulled Preston up to his feet, shoving him forcefully away from the building and warning him that he would be facing assault charges if he ever returned to the premises. Preston stumbled away from the building, his expensive custom suit torn at the shoulder and covered in dark, wet street grime. He managed to drag himself back to his rented sports car, collapsing into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut to hide from the staring public. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, gasping for air, as his entire world burned to ash around him. His phone suddenly vibrated inside his pocket, breaking through his frantic panic. He pulled it out, expecting an update from his father or his legal team, but the name glowing on the screen belonged to Alana. Preston opened the message with trembling fingers. "Preston, please," the text read. "My sister just kicked us out of the house and took all our bags. We have absolutely nothing and nowhere to go. Please tell me you have some cash left. Send a car for me, please, I love you." Preston stared at the desperate, begging words of the woman he was supposed to marry just 12 hours ago. The woman he had spent months pretending to adore just to access a trust fund that never existed for him. A cold, vicious sneer spread across his dirty, bleeding face. He did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse for her pathetic situation. He typed his response using one hand, his fingers leaving bloody smudges on the glass screen. "You are nothing but homeless garbage, Alana. Rot in the streets where you belong." He pressed send and immediately blocked her number, erasing her from his phone forever. He officially severed the toxic, financially motivated relationship that had ultimately destroyed both of their pathetic lives, binding them together in nothing but absolute spectacular ruin. 6 months is a relatively short amount of time in the grand scheme of a human life, but for the Jenkins family, half a year was more than enough time to completely shatter every single delusion of grandeur they ever held. The freezing Chicago winter had arrived, bringing a brutal, biting wind that whipped through the narrow alleyways of the South Side. This was miles away from the pristine, heated streets of the Gold Coast. Harrison and Vivian now lived in a cramped, damp, two-bedroom apartment located on the second floor of a decaying brick building. The walls were so paper-thin that they could hear their neighbors arguing every single night. The constant mechanical roar of the elevated train rattled their cheap windows every 15 minutes, serving as a relentless reminder of their spectacular fall from grace. There were no crystal chandeliers or imported marble floors here. The apartment was furnished with battered second-hand pieces they had scrounged together from discount thrift stores. Their entire existence had been reduced to surviving paycheck to paycheck, a concept they had mocked other people for experiencing just a few months prior. Vivian, who used to spend her Tuesday mornings sipping imported champagne and getting expensive custom facial treatments at exclusive downtown spas, was currently experiencing a completely different reality. She stood shivering inside a brightly lit public laundromat located on a dirty street corner, holding a cracked plastic laundry basket filled with cheap synthetic clothing. She wore a faded, oversized gray hoodie and a pair of worn-out sweatpants that she had purchased from a discount retail bin. Vivian kept her head down, wrapping a thick wool scarf tightly around her face and wearing dark, oversized sunglasses despite being indoors. She was absolutely terrified that someone might recognize her. She lived in a constant state of agonizing fear that one of her former high society friends, or perhaps one of the domestic workers she used to verbally abuse, might walk into the laundromat and see the great Vivian Jenkins feeding quarters into a rusty washing machine. She struggled to push the heavy wet clothes into the dryer, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails long gone, replaced by chipped broken fingernails ruined by manual labor. A young mother next to her accidentally bumped her laundry cart, and Vivian instinctively opened her mouth to snap a vicious elite insult, but the words died in her throat. She had no power here. She was just another struggling woman standing under flickering fluorescent lights, praying she had enough loose change to dry her cheap polyester shirts. The sheer humiliation of her daily existence chewed away at whatever fragile pride she had left, leaving her completely hollow inside. While Vivian was hiding her face in a local laundromat, Harrison was experiencing his own personal version of absolute hell on the industrial outskirts of the city. For decades, he had walked around in custom-tailored suits pretending to be a brilliant logistics executive while secretly running his company into the ground. He had commanded boardrooms and demanded respect from terrified employees. Now Harrison was wearing a bright orange high-visibility vest over a stained thermal shirt, working as a low-level shift supervisor at a massive commercial shipping warehouse. It was a bitterly poetic punishment for a man who had stolen his daughter's college fund to save a failing logistics empire. He stood on the freezing concrete floor of the loading dock, holding a digital scanning device, trying to direct a crew of younger, stronger workers who completely ignored his arrogant barking orders. His aging body ached with every single step, his knees throbbing from standing on hard concrete for 10 hours a day. The warehouse manager, a 25-year-old kid fresh out of community college, walked up to Harrison and publicly berated him for falling behind on the inventory quotas. Harrison's face turned a dark shade of red, his old ego flaring up as he wanted to scream at the young manager and demand respect. But he swallowed his pride and stared at the dirty concrete floor, muttering a pathetic apology. He knew he could not afford to lose this miserable minimum wage job. The corporate blacklist I had initiated across the Chicago financial sector had completely destroyed his career. No bank would give him a loan, and no reputable company would even grant him an interview. He was trapped in this freezing, noisy warehouse, forced to perform the exact kind of grueling manual labor he had spent his entire life looking down upon. The bitter reality of his complete financial ruin haunted him every single time he scanned a cardboard box, knowing he would die a forgotten, broken man working in the shadows. The generational curse of the Jenkins family. Arrogance trickled all the way down to Alana, who was currently facing the most brutal social execution imaginable. Alana used to spend her days carrying designer handbags through luxury department stores, treating retail workers like invisible peasants, while she spent money she did not actually own. Now, Alana stood behind a brightly lit glass counter inside a struggling suburban shopping mall, wearing a tight, uncomfortable black polyester uniform. She was working as a minimum wage retail associate at a mid-tier makeup kiosk, forced to smile and offer perfume samples to passing teenagers. Her feet ached from standing in cheap shoes, and her fake smile felt like physical torture. She was wiping down a messy foundation display when three familiar women walked up to her counter, laughing loudly and carrying massive bags from expensive designer boutiques. Alana froze, dropping her cleaning cloth as a wave of pure terror washed over her. The three women were her former bridesmaids, the wealthy elite socialites who had watched her scream and cry on the dance floor of her ruined wedding 6 months ago. The women stopped at the counter, leaning over the glass display, and looking at Alana with expressions of absolute malicious delight. One of the former bridesmaids picked up a cheap lipstick tester and held it out toward Alana, demanding that she demonstrate the color on her hand. Alana's hands shook violently as she took the tester, her face burning with a fiery, intense shame. The women whispered cruel jokes to each other, mocking Alana's cheap uniform and her disastrous fall from high society grace. They purposely asked her difficult, demeaning questions, forcing her to explain the ingredients of budget cosmetics while they laughed right in her face. Alana wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the makeup and run out of the mall, but she needed the meager paycheck to afford her share of the rent at the damp, noisy apartment she now shared with her parents. She forced herself to keep her head down carefully, applying the lipstick tester to the wrist of the woman who used to praise her beauty, while the others recorded the pathetic interaction on their smartphones. Her golden child status was completely obliterated, replaced by a miserable existence serving the exact same people she used to rule over. The entire family was now trapped in a relentless cycle of daily humiliation and exhausting manual labor, completely stripped of the fake wealth and toxic prestige they had worshipped for decades. They had built their entire identities around looking down on other people, and now they were forced to look up from the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. There was no magical trust fund waiting to save them, and there was no wealthy family left to scam. They were forced to wake up every single morning and face the brutal, unforgiving reality of their own catastrophic choices, perfectly isolated in the miserable poverty they had always feared the most. 6 months after the spectacular implosion at the Drake Hotel, Preston Chamberlain was experiencing his own personal version of a living nightmare. The reality of his brutal new life had settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket of despair. He was gripping the sticky plastic steering wheel of a beat-up 10-year-old sedan that rattled violently every single time he drove over a pothole. The heater barely worked, blowing a weak stream of lukewarm air that did absolutely nothing to fight off the freezing Chicago winter wind seeping through the poorly sealed windows. This was a catastrophic downgrade from the custom luxury sports cars he was used to driving casually down the magnificent mile. Preston was wearing a cheap, stiff polyester suit that he bought off the rack at a discount department store because his entire wardrobe of bespoke tailored clothing had been seized and liquidated by Apex Capital during the massive corporate raid. The cheap fabric itched horribly against his skin, serving as a constant, miserable physical reminder of his complete financial ruin. He was currently working as a mid-level life insurance salesman, forced to sit in a dreary gray cubicle, making dozens of humiliating cold calls every single day to people who did not want to speak to him. He spent his miserable 8-hour shifts begging middle-class families to buy basic coverage, completely stripped of the untouchable old money prestige he used to hide behind like an impenetrable shield. His former fraternity brothers and prep school friends had all blocked his phone number the very same day the news broke about his family going completely bankrupt. He was an absolute ghost in a city he used to treat like his own personal playground. His father, Richard, was currently facing multiple federal investigations for corporate fraud, and his fragile mother refused to leave their tiny rented apartment, entirely consumed by the shame of their public downfall. Preston had absolutely nothing left but a desperate, pathetic clinging to a past life that no longer existed. He pulled his rattling, noisy sedan up to the towering wrought iron gates of the prestigious Oak Brook Country Club. This was the exact same elite sanctuary where his family had held a platinum-level membership for 4 consecutive generations. It was the place where he used to smoke imported cigars, drink $1,000 scotch, and laugh at people who actually had to work for a living. The uniformed valet attendant, who used to sprint eagerly across the circular driveway to open Preston's car door, took one look at the rusted, dented sedan and immediately crossed his arms, refusing to move a single inch from his podium. Preston rolled down his squeaking manual window and yelled at the valet, demanding the respect he thought he still deserved, but the young man simply pointed a gloved finger toward the distant gravel overflow parking lot, reserved exclusively for delivery drivers and maintenance staff. The sheer indignity of parking his own vehicle made Preston's face burn with hot, angry humiliation. He trudged across the freezing, uneven asphalt, wrapping his cheap thin coat tightly around his shivering body, determined to walk into the club and pretend he still belonged among the city elite. He desperately needed to network today, because he needed to find a wealthy investor who might take pity on him and offer him a lucrative job to escape the soul-crushing misery of selling cheap insurance policies. Preston marched up the grand marble steps and pushed his way through the heavy mahogany doors, stepping into the warm, luxurious lobby that smelled beautifully of rich leather wood smoke and imported winter flowers. He puffed out his chest, trying his absolute hardest to project that familiar, arrogant Chamberlain confidence. But the entire illusion shattered the absolute second. He approached the front desk. The head concierge, a distinguished older man who had known Preston since he was just a spoiled child, did not offer his usual warm, welcoming greeting. Instead, the concierge expression completely to solid ice. He placed both hands flat on the polished mahogany counter, physically blocking Preston from taking another step toward the private dining rooms and exclusive lounges. Preston tried to push past him, throwing out a fake charming smile and loudly announcing that he was meeting a former college friend for a private lunch in the main dining hall. The concierge did not budge an inch. From his post, he looked Preston up and down, taking in the cheap, shiny suit, the frayed collar and the scuffed discount shoes, with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust that cut Preston right to the bone. "I am sorry, Preston, but you are absolutely not permitted past this desk," the concierge said, his voice intentionally echoing loudly enough for several wealthy members sitting in the nearby leather chairs to hear the rejection. Preston felt a cold, nervous sweat break out across his forehead, but he tried to force a loud, confident laugh, acting like this was just a simple clerical misunderstanding. "Do not be ridiculous, Thomas," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "My family has been a foundational pillar of this club for nearly a century. Put my lunch on the Chamberlain family tab and step aside so I can get through." The concierge shook his head slowly, his eyes completely devoid of any human sympathy. "There is no Chamberlain family tab anymore. Preston, your membership was officially revoked by the board of directors 4 months ago due to extreme non-payment of monthly dues and a complete failure to maintain the required financial standing dictated by our bylaws. You are no longer a member here, and frankly, your uninvited presence is making our actual paying guests incredibly uncomfortable. I must ask you to turn around and exit the premises immediately before I am forced to call security to escort you out." The brutal public rejection hit Preston like a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the wind completely out of him. The wealthy patrons sitting in the lounge nearby had completely stopped their conversations and were openly staring at him, whispering behind their hands and shaking their heads in disgust. He was the ultimate social pariah, entirely exiled from the elite wealthy circles he used to rule with an iron fist. He opened his mouth to argue, to scream about his legacy and his bloodline, but 2 large security guards had already stepped out from the main hallway, crossing their massive arms and staring him down with pure intimidation. Preston realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he had absolutely zero power in this building anymore. He was just a broke, trespassing insurance salesman, wearing a cheap suit trying to infiltrate a world that had locked its doors to him forever. He stumbled backward away from the polished desk, his face burning with a fiery, intense shame that made his eyes water with pathetic, unshed tears. As he turned around in complete miserable defeat to begin his humiliating walk of shame back out into the freezing Chicago cold, his eyes caught the bright glow of a massive flat-screen television mounted high above the lobby bar. The large screen was tuned to a major national financial news network, broadcasting the latest corporate updates. Preston froze dead in his tracks, his cheap plastic briefcase slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the marble floor with a loud, echoing thud. The bold breaking news ticker, scrolling rapidly across the bottom of the screen, completely paralyzed his entire nervous system. There, filling the entire massive high-definition television, was a crisp, professional photograph of Maya Jenkins. She looked absolutely stunning, wearing an impeccably tailored designer business suit, projecting an overwhelming aura of untouchable power and supreme confidence. The news anchor was speaking enthusiastically about the massive seismic shifts in the Midwestern commercial real estate market and the brilliant minds behind the corporate takeovers. Preston read the bright red headline flashing boldly below her smiling face and felt his entire miserable world collapse all over again, crushing his chest. The bold text proudly announced, Maya Jenkins named Chicago top real estate titan after ruthless apex capital acquisitions dominate the Gold Coast market. He stood there completely frozen in the lobby of the exclusive club that had just kicked him out to the curb watching the brilliant woman he had arrogantly called new money trash be universally celebrated as the most powerful, wealthy, and feared financial predator in the entire city of Chicago. The news segment cut to a brief video clip of Maya walking confidently out of a massive glass skyscraper surrounded by her elite security team, looking perfectly untouchable. Preston realized in that agonizing moment that while he was begging for scraps in a freezing parking lot Maya had successfully conquered, the very corporate world he used to claim as his birthright. The two security guards finally grabbed Preston by the shoulders, shoving him roughly toward the heavy wooden exit doors. He was tossed out into the bitter winter wind, leaving him shivering alone on the sidewalk, while the glowing television screen continued to broadcast the spectacular, magnificent victory of the woman who had single-handedly destroyed the arrogant Chamberlain empire forever. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the Josephine Trust headquarters offered a completely unobstructed view of the freezing Chicago skyline. The corporate boardroom was located on the top floor of a sleek modern skyscraper that my firm Apex Capital had recently acquired. It was a space designed entirely for absolute power and quiet execution. There were no flashy gold fixtures or ridiculous crystal chandeliers. Here the room was furnished with a massive solid oak conference table and ergonomic leather chairs. The environment smelled of fresh espresso and expensive paper. The heating system hummed softly, pushing back against the bitter winter wind that was currently whipping across the icy waters of Lake Michigan far below us. I stood by the window, looking down at the tiny cars crawling along the busy downtown streets, feeling completely removed from the chaos of the city. I wore a tailored charcoal business suit, and my natural hair was pulled back into a sharp professional style. There was no need to wear uncomfortable designer gowns or fake smiles in this building. This was my absolute domain. Elias Thorne walked into the boardroom, his heavy leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. My chief operating officer, Lauren, followed closely behind him, carrying two thick black binders. She placed the binders directly in the center of the polished oak table right under the bright overhead lights. Elias clicked the brass locks on his briefcase open and pulled out a stack of pristine legal documents, setting them down next to the binders. We are ready to officially close the books on both portfolios. Maya Elias announced, his deep voice echoing slightly in the large, empty room. The federal bankruptcy courts have fully processed the liquidation orders, and the civil litigation windows have completely expired. Nobody is coming to save them. The assets have been successfully stripped, evaluated, and absorbed directly into the master trust accounts. I walked away from the window and took my seat at the head of the long conference table, looking down at the two thick binders. The binder on the left contained the complete financial autopsy of the Chamberlain family empire. It detailed the sale of their historic hotels, the auctioning of their private estates, and the total erasure of their old money legacy. The binder on the right contained the miserable remains of the Jenkins family logistics company and the final eviction notices from the Gold Coast mansion. Those two black binders represented the absolute destruction of every single person who had ever tried to use me, humiliate me, or steal my future. Lauren slid a heavy silver fountain pen across the smooth surface of the table, stopping right in front of my hands. These are the final liquidation authorizations, Lauren explained, pointing to the documents Elias had laid out. Once you sign these pages, the corporate entities belonging to Richard Chamberlain and Harrison Jenkins will be legally dissolved forever. The holding companies will be permanently wiped from the state registry, and their remaining debts will be written off as total losses. They will officially cease to exist in the financial sector. I picked up the silver pen, feeling the cool metal against my skin. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not feel any sudden rush of sadness or any lingering sentimental guilt. I pulled the first stack of papers toward me and smoothly signed my name on the bottom line, executing the total legal death of the Chamberlain family business. I slid the next document over and signed it again, officially destroying my father, fraudulent logistics company. My signature was sharp, deliberate, and completely unwavering. I signed document after document until the entire stack was finalized, sealing their fate with permanent wet ink. Elias gathered the signed papers and placed them back into his briefcase, locking the brass latches with a satisfying mechanical click. "It is done," Elias said respectfully, nodding his head. "The extraction is fully complete, and the Master Trust is now holding an unprecedented amount of liquid capital. You have successfully protected your grandmother legacy from the parasites who tried to drain it dry. But now we must address the future of these funds. The capital cannot just sit idle in the holding accounts." I placed the silver pen back onto the table and looked up at a large, beautiful oil portrait of Grandmother Josephine that was hanging on the far wall of the boardroom. Her painted eyes looked down at the table, fierce and uncompromising. "I have been thinking very carefully about what she would have wanted me to do with this immense wealth," I said, leaning forward and folding my hands together. "She did not build her empire so that her lazy relatives could buy country club memberships, and she certainly did not build it to bail out arrogant, racist aristocrats who look down on our community. She built her wealth to create actual power and true independence." I turned my attention to Lauren, who was ready to take notes on her digital tablet. "I want to establish a new philanthropic division within the trust," I instructed, keeping my voice clear and authoritative. "We are going to create the Josephine Jenkins Memorial Scholarship and Innovation Fund. I want to allocate $50 million of liquid capital to seed the endowment. Immediately, this fund will not support elite legacy institutions or traditional business schools that only accept the children of wealthy donors." "What are the specific parameters for the endowment?" Lauren asked, her fingers flying rapidly across her screen. "The scholarship fund will be dedicated exclusively to supporting young, underrepresented Black women who want to enter the financial, technology, and commercial real estate sectors," I explained, outlining the exact vision I had spent the last several weeks developing. "We will provide full tuition coverage for young women who demonstrate raw talent but lack the financial resources to access higher education. We will also provide aggressive startup capital for Black female entrepreneurs who want to build their own software companies or invest in commercial properties. I want to completely bypass the traditional corporate gatekeepers who try to keep women of color out of the executive suites," I continued, feeling a powerful surge of adrenaline pumping through my chest. My family thought a Black woman working in data analytics was a source of deep shame. They thought the only way to achieve status was to beg for table scraps from old money, white elites. I am going to use their liquidated assets to build an absolute army of brilliant, ruthless, independent Black women who will conquer the financial sector on their own terms. We are going to create generational wealth for people who actually work for a living, instead of people who just inherit their titles." Elias let out a low, impressed whistle, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you, Maya," he said, a genuine smile breaking through his usual cold, professional exterior. "You are taking the poison they tried to inject into this family and turning it into a cure. You are building exactly what she always dreamed of seeing in this city." Lauren finished typing the initial directives into her tablet and looked up at me, her expression filled with profound respect. She looked at the two black binders holding the ruined lives of my parents and my sister, and then she looked back at my calm, focused face. "After everything they did to you?" Maya Lauren asked softly, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet boardroom. "Do you feel any regret about leaving them with absolutely nothing out there in the freezing cold?" I looked at the empty chairs around the massive oak table, thinking about my mother struggling in a dirty laundromat and my sister getting mocked by her former bridesmaids. I thought about the burning sting of the slap Vivian had delivered to my face and the horrific realization that they had tried to sell my future to save their fake luxury. I slowly shook my head, completely rejecting the very concept of regret. "I feel absolutely no regret, Lauren," I answered, my voice perfectly steady and clear. Toxicity is finally cut out like a tumor and the body can finally begin to heal. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear or utter a single word of pain. I slowly turned my back to face my mother. Her chest was heaving, and for a split second a flash of pure panic crossed her eyes when she realized I was not breaking down. Crying like she expected, I calmly turned around and walked over to where my earring had fallen near the velvet curtains. I bent down, picked up the diamond stud and secured it tightly in my hand. The entire room watched me in stunned, breathless silence, expecting a massive emotional breakdown or a screaming match. Instead, I stood up straight, smoothed the wrinkles from my simple black dress, and pulled my phone from my clutch. I dialed a specific number I had kept on speed dial for 3 long years, waiting patiently for the exact moment my family would cross the point of no return. "Elias," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotions striking through the heavy silence of the room. "It is me. Execute Grandmother Josephine Directive 4. I did not wait for a response. I slipped the phone back into my bag, turned my back on my mother, horrified face, and walked confidently out of the ballroom. The real wedding gift was about to be delivered, and they had absolutely no idea the level of destruction coming for them. True strength is not found in status symbols or external validation, but in resilience and unwavering self-belief. Maya's family relied on empty facades and greed, underestimating the quiet competence she built in the shadows. When you stop seeking approval from toxic influences and focus on cultivating your own capabilities, you reclaim your autonomy. Success is not about proving yourself to others. It is about building a foundation so solid that the opinions of those who once belittled you become entirely irrelevant. Integrity and strategic self-advocacy are the true tools of personal transformation and liberation. Stop seeking approval from those who don't see your worth. Start building your own legacy today.